Welcome, friends. I am really excited to spend the next hour and a half with all of you talking about change that never stops, whether it's one change where the hits just keep coming, or I know so many of us are experiencing overlapping change where like one thing's changing and now something else is changing and now something else is changing. And like, how on earth do we keep our heads above water? And so I'm hoping today that we can have that conversation. Um, for those of you, is my clicking working? It's not. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Julia Monahan. I am an organizational development consultant. I worked in the nonprofit sector for over 15 years now, so my whole career. And my focus is on doing equity-driven organizational transformation and participatory strategy work in the nonprofit sector. And the work I'm really drawn to is how we think about creating the conditions for people-centered organizations. That's where I got the name of my practice from. So how we create the conditions for human beings, which all of us are, at least until ChatGPT takes over, to really thrive inside our nonprofit contexts as we continue to contribute to all the important mission-driven work that we're part of. And so that's who I am. I run this monthly webinar series mostly as a way to feel helpful in these strange times where I think we're all looking for ways to be helpful. I think change is something that a lot of us are grappling with right now, both internally and externally. And so hopefully today's conversation helps you with that a little bit. And I'm going to give us a chance for us to introduce ourselves to each other in a minute, but let me just tell you a little bit about what we have planned for today. So the purpose of today's conversation is to hopefully equip our fine nonprofit folks in this room, which I think most of you are, with some really practical, people-centered approaches for navigating ongoing, compounding organizational change. So not just like the nice, neat, like, oh, we're doing a change thing, but like I said, that those situations where we've got a lot of changes either happening to us or that we're driving, and we're trying to make sense across them. And so in service of this, my goal today is that we'll explore some different kinds of change, just to give us some language to talk about them. Use a bit of a people-centered lens to explain and understand how change impacts us as people and organizations and why. So why does change feel the way it does to us? Why can it be so strenuous? And then, like I said, talk about some hopefully practical approaches that you can adopt in the short, medium, and long term to help you, your teams, your organization build resilience and be able to hopefully not just survive, but thrive in the context of all this change that's happening. And so, as I mentioned before, kind of why, even before the last couple of years, with globalization and the internet and so many factors, we're experiencing a more and more rapidly shifting, more volatile world. And as nonprofits and frontline organizations, we're right at the front seat of that, and really living through the impact of those changes every day. So that's something that I'm sure, and I'm going to hear about it in a minute, but that I'm sure that all of you are grappling with. So this is a very real thing. And we know that change is rarely discrete and rarely sequential. When we think about change management, we like to think about like nice, neat Gantt charts that start here and end here and have this linear path. But we all know that the reality is that is not how it rolls. And so managing that ambiguity, managing that uncertainty while you've got sort of multiple things happening at once is especially challenging. And one of the challenges of that is that the strain we feel from change can really accumulate and compound. And so when we've got all these different things layering on top of each other, things end up feeling a lot harder, a lot more challenging. There's a lot more friction, a lot more tension, which just makes it hard to do the work that we're all committed to doing, and sucks for us as people and doesn't feel good and weighs down on our physical and emotional health. And so hopefully today we can talk about that. I want to give us a simple way to think about types of change I think what I'm about to say is not going to be revolutionary, but it hopefully helps us understand or think about the reason why some changes feel a little bit more destabilizing than others. And so when we think about changes that we experience in an organization, I think the first question we can ask ourselves is this change intentional? Are we doing this on purpose? And so if the answer is yes, we're engaging in planned change. In some ways, the friendliest kind of change. We're like, maybe we have some semblance of control. Maybe we're doing this on purpose. On the other side is emergent change. So I heard someone talk about generational change in organizations. That's an emergent change. As new generations enter the workforce and as those generations step into leadership roles, organizational dynamics change. That's not something we're planning. That's just something that is happening in the world around us. Another question we can ask ourselves is, do we have control over this change? Is this something that we're choosing to start and stop? Are we intervening with this change? And so if the answer is yes, then it's something that we're making choices around, which is nice because also we can sometimes make choices about speeding up or slowing down or putting on pause or doing it in this way or that way. If we don't have control over the change, then sometimes we're in a situation where it feels like we're just reacting, where things are happening to us and we're just trying to respond. And then I think the third question we can ask about a change is this change triggered by internal or external dynamics? So if it's internal, I heard, Dorothy, you were talking about leadership change. That's an internal dynamic. So we're going through a change because we have a significant staff person who's stepping out of the role that they're in. But then there's also a lot of external dynamics that I heard you talk about too, Alicia, in terms of policy and funding, right? This is all stuff that's happening around us that's impacting us and impacting how we show up. And so with these kinds of three categories of change, obviously, nothing ever fits neatly into categories. So there's a lot of overlap here. There's a spectrum here where like it's more or less controllable, it's more or less external. But more complex change has more than one of these facets, right? So if it's an external change that's emergent and we're only reacting to it, that can be a lot more complicated than it's an internal change where we have a lot of control and maybe we've planned to do this on purpose. And so it impacts a lot how much agency we have, how much we're able to create the conditions for success. So again, I don't think there's anything revolutionary here, but this is about understanding kind of the different flavors or the different ways that change can show up in our organizations and our lives, frankly. Pausing here for a second. Anything here strike you? Does this framing help you see something in a different way? Thinking about the chat that you were just having in the breakouts. When you think about the changes you were talking about, do you have a sense of kind of how they would fall in terms of these categories? Did someone just unmute? Or is that just aspirational?
I can go again.
Bless you, Alicia. Dive in.
And sorry, it's Alicia.
Alicia, I'm sorry about that.
All good. Happens all the time. Yeah, I mean, I think part of what has felt really challenging about the policy piece is it feels so external and we feel so reactive. So it feels very little control and feels very externally driven.
Yeah. Part of what we're going to talk about when we get into some of the later slides is why that lack of control feels so terrible. Part of what interests me about a lot of the work I do kind of falls into the field of cognitive science and neuroscience, like what is true about our brains that create the experiences that we have. And our brains' number one function is to keep us safe. Like everything else is secondary, but our brain's first job is like keep body alive. And one of the ways that our brains do that is by creating certainty and stability. So it knows what to predict so it can keep you safe. And so lack of stability, lack of certainty our brain's like worst nightmare. And so it's why often change triggers so much anxiety and so much discomfort and so much friction, even in a planned change where we have control, because our brains don't like that uncertainty. And so that can be so difficult, especially when it's coming at it from us from so many different angles, when it feels so existential, when it's coming after our livelihoods, our identities, if we really deeply identify with the work we do, which many of us in the nonprofit sector do. So that's very challenging. Well, thank you for sharing a bit about how you've experienced this. I want to share a little bit about how kind of I see these impacts and hopefully in a way that helps us make sense of it. So that is backwards. So when I think about the impacts of change in organizations, I think about them cognitively, emotionally, and then the impacts category is more like how it impacts the wider functionality of the organization and how we do our work. And I think that there's linkages between all these things, which is why I've got cognitively first, because I think a lot of these things are just rooted in how are our brains wired? What do our brains need? And what are the ways in which our brains misbehave when those needs are not met? And so the first thing, we talked about this already, is that our brains are wired for predictability. They want to know what's coming next so that they can prepare us for what's coming next. That is when our brains are happiest. When we don't know what's coming next, all kinds of things happen to us cognitively. We start doing scenario planning. We spend a lot of cognitive and emotional energy thinking about what if, what if, what if, what if. Well, we're doing that because our brain's trying to prepare us, but it takes a lot of energy and it can be really lame. I mean, lame is not the word I want to use. It can be really scary if our brain is going to all these like worst case scenarios. It's also really anxiety inducing for our brains. And so especially if you're already someone who likes stability or experiences anxiety, that lack of predictability can really amp those things up. And so emotionally for us as individuals and as teams, that lack of predictability can feel really unsafe. And that creates fear and anxiety in individuals, fear and anxiety in teams. Thanks, Mark. Glad to have you here. I will also be circulating the recording, so if folks want to catch up on what they missed, you'll have a chance. Uncertainty can also trigger grief, loss, or vigilance. So when we think about grieving the stability that we had, grieving the organization that was, grieving the role that we had, the colleagues we had, all of those emotional experiences are really complicated to carry into the workplace. And so what does this look like in a work environment? It can be really hard to focus and collaborate effectively. So if our brains are caught up in all this uncertainty and fear and anxiety and grief and vigilance and all this spinning, right? Sitting down at your desk and getting something tangible done, going to a meeting and brainstorming or having an idea or building a strategy, all those things become much more difficult. Fear and anxiety can also create a lot more interpersonal friction or friction between teams. Maybe we usually get along and have a great relationship, but when I'm under so much emotional strain, maybe I give less grace. Maybe I'm a little bit more short. I'm a little bit less patient. Maybe you take those things personally because why wouldn't you? And now suddenly we're really straining what might have been a really positive working environment. We're maybe eroding what might have been a really high trust relationship, not because of anything about us and our relationship, but because of all this cognitive and emotional pressure that we're under. And then all this contributes to functional friction. So in the context of all this uncertainty, we talk about policies changing, budgets changing, priorities changing. We spin our wheels. We spend a lot of time figuring out what is it that we're supposed to be doing? How are we supposed to be doing it? I talk to a lot of leaders in this moment who are saying, my team is like complaining about how busy they are, how overwhelmed they are, and how it's taking everybody so long to do everything, but we don't have more work than usual. In some cases, we have less work than usual. Why is that happening? It's happening because all the work is harder to do because we don't have clarity about what we're doing and why, because there's all this uncertainty around us. So it feels like we're doing more. It feels like we're more overwhelmed because we're spending a lot more cognitive energy figuring out what's the most important thing I'm supposed to be working on today? How do I stay focused on that thing? And so it feels like we're a lot busier. The other thing I want to say is that, and these two things are very integrated, competing or unclear priorities increase our cognitive load. So this is part of what I was just getting at. Cognitive load being how many balls our brains have in the air at once, which there is a limit, right, to how many balls our brains can keep at the air at once effectively. So having all these changes happen, and if we're not clear on how those changes impact us, we're not sure what's important to us. And so it creates frustration. What am I supposed to focus on? I'm going to give my best guess. Oh, my boss told me I was focusing on the wrong thing. Or I put all this effort into something that I thought was important, but then it turns out we're not actually going to use that thing. What a waste of my time. All that's really frustrating. We also experience more fear around decision making when things aren't certain because we're fearful about making the wrong decision. And this can be more or less acute depending on the overall culture in your organization and how comfortable your organization is with failure and getting things wrong. If you live in a really perfectionist culture where like making mistakes is the end of the world, you're not going to have people making decisions in a time of ambiguity because I have no idea if I'm going to get it right. And so things freeze up. You have a lot of bottlenecking. You have a lot of people playing hot potato with decisions because how on earth am I going to get this decision right when there's so much that's unknown and the risk is too high to get it wrong? So functionally, what does that look like? What I was just saying, things take longer or are more difficult than they might have been in the past, or maybe than they need to be, because we're spending all of this energy figuring out what are we supposed to be doing, who am I supposed to be collaborating with, who needs to know this information. That all takes up space in our minds. There's stress or overwhelm that doesn't feel like it lines up with how much actual work we have. And so that experience of leaders saying, why are we so busy? We're not actually creating all that much work product because we're doing a lot of churning. And then there's a lot more decision fatigue. I don't want to make decisions. I'm resisting making decisions. I'm deferring decisions. And we all know that a decision deferred is still a decision, right? It still has consequences. Thanks for joining, Lauren. And again, I'll send out the recording if you'd like it. So there's a lot here. I want to pause here to say, A, how is this landing? And B, is there anything that you're experiencing that I didn't catch here? Yeah, burnout in the nonprofit field is already so prominent. So that's that compounding impact. I was having this conversation with a client where she was saying, we're not even that busy, but people are telling me they're so stressed. And if you think about stress and overwhelm as a bucket, if you're already here, even if you're just adding like this much more stress, it's enough to overflow. So it's enough to create that kind of crisis moment, even if the thing that creates the tipping point doesn't feel like it should be that big of a deal. And that's what it means to live in that burnout culture. You are not resilient to the next thing, even if the next thing is small. Anything else that's landing or that you're finding interesting or that you have questions about, or maybe different things that you're seeing some of these show up, different ways you're seeing these show up? I mean, I just kind of say these things out loud and then I'm tired, right? Like, ugh, lame. Bigger than lame, but like I said, I try to be funny. So does it feel like there's anything that you're noticing in your organization that's not on this list? This is maybe plenty. So the thing I want to add is on top of all this, the way that we experience change is also inexplicably rooted in our own identities and lived experiences. So all those things that I listed, if you zoom out and think about an organization, everybody is experiencing those in all kinds of different ways, right? We all have different capacity for change. We all have different levels of resilience. So like you're already have got people all over the place on the emotional and cognitive map. One layer to add to that is it comes down to experience. So when we think about how we've been impacted by change in the past, if we've been laid off once or twice before, that hypervigilance about the next layoff way up here versus someone who hasn't experienced that before. Thanks, Alicia. Really glad to have you here. So how we've experienced change, how it's impacted us. Our overall sense of safety and belonging in our organization. If we have a really high sense of belonging in our organization, we have a lot more capacity to navigate some of these things because we have connection and relational capital with our peers. If we have a really low sense of belonging, that's not possible. Based on gender, based on race, based on other identity factors, there are different pressures on us to behave in different kinds of ways. So pressure on women to not be too emotional, pressure on Black folks to not live into that caricature of anger, creates this added pressure to compartmentalize how we're feeling. I can't show up this way. I can't show up that way. I can't acknowledge how I'm feeling. And that doubles back on us. The support systems we do or don't have outside the workplace. Are we in stable friendships and partnerships and relationships? Do we have a healthy family system that we're part of? Do we have friends and hobbies? We'll happily share the slides. Definitely we'll share the slides. So all that stuff that's happening outside the workplace impacts our ability to survive and thrive with these things in the workplace. And you don't always know that about somebody. How financially secure are you? Do you have savings? Do you have a partner who's employed? Or if this organization goes down, it's a really terrifying prospect for you. That impacts how heavy all this is for you. Physical and mental well-being, access to healthcare. Again, is this like the last drop in your bucket that's going to send you over the edge? Caregiving roles and responsibilities. Do you have kids at home? Are you caring for parents? Are you caring for a chronically ill partner or spouse? So these are all things that are part of our identities that are happening outside of the workplace potentially, but that are impacting our capacity to survive these contexts, not just survive them, but like keep chipping away at that mission impact, keep chipping away at the work that we're all here to do. And so that is another layer of all this when you think about teams and organizations is everybody is in a different place in terms of what they can handle, what they can lean into, what they're capable of. Pausing again there. Any reactions to this? Questions about this? Cool. And then one more thing before we talk about, so like, what the hell do we do about all this? What is uniquely hard about overlapping and ongoing change? There's no rocket science here. Every new change is drawing on our emotional capacity, our cognitive capacity, our attention, our judgment. How many of those balls can we keep in the air at the same time? I know that I'm not a good juggler. The balls drop all the time. The more that's happening, the more our cognitive load grows. The recovery time we have between hard things shrinks, makes things feel disproportionately hard. We don't have time to catch up. Going back to the earlier comment about burnout culture and nonprofits, if we don't have time to recover, we're just like dragging ourselves from one crisis to the next, right? Which is not how we thrive as human beings, but it's also not how we do good work. And I also want to say, this is all a totally normal, predictable human response. I think there are a lot of us in the nonprofit sector that hold ourselves to really high standards for the work that we want to do, the impact that we want to have. And so when we see ourselves having normal human reactions to things, we can get hard on ourselves. And I want to say, we don't need to do that because this is all totally normal, because these things are hard. if it feels hard, it's because it is hard. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. And there are things that we can do to make it easier for ourselves, easier for our teams and our systems to navigate them. But the fact that we're struggling, the fact that we don't have the capacity, the fact that we're struggling to focus, of course we are. We're just people until ChatGPT takes over, but we're not there yet. We're not yet augmented humans. So I want to talk a little bit about the conditions that we can create to navigate this. Is there anything else we want to name about how this feels and why it feels this way before we dig into like, what can we actually do about this? Again, I know there was a lot of bummer there, so like maybe we don't need to add to the list.
I just have a question. How does,
Yeah.
and maybe this is embedded in your second slide, but how does, like, some people just seem better equipped because of their personality to deal
Yeah.
with change, and other people, they're just not, well, for whatever reason, right? They're good at one thing,
Yeah.
but maybe not dealing with change. So I didn't
Totally.
know how that kind of blends into those two different sets of slides in terms of
Yeah.
how you navigate change within an organization, because yeah, different people with different personalities that,
Have different strengths.
yeah.
I'll maybe respond to that now because I don't think I touched on that in the slides, but I do often talk about that in the context of organizational change more broadly. Every organization has people that are like, I will touch that change with a 10-foot pole. You will drive me kicking and screaming over that line. And you have some people that are like, I am so excited. Bring on the chaos. I have so many ideas. And so part of effectively managing change is figuring out, A, how do you create opportunities for the people that lean into change, that are creative in moments of change, that are excited by the potential and the innovation? How do we create opportunities for them to lean into that? How are they brainstorming what we're going to be moving into next? How are they generating ideas? How are they providing support to their peers to help rally folks? How are we maximizing that natural capacity and energy? And then the flip side for the folks are who struggle with change, who are having a harder time. And this might vary. It could be like, I'm fine with that change, but this one's killing me. That's part of the complicated part. It's about how do we create support for those folks to move through the process with as little friction as possible, which is part of what we're going to talk about next. But for those people who have that natural inclination, making sure that there's space to bring them into the process to help come up with ideas or implement ideas is critical, because you're maximizing that energy and you're recognizing that some people's capacity is going to be diminished in this moment. So let's get that extra capacity where we can find it. Does that make sense, Dorothy? And Megan, I saw your hand go up and then go down. Did you have a similar question?
Just to say, I think that's part of maybe to thinking about Dorothy's question. What I liked about your last slide and your comments, that everything everything you were describing was completely predictable, completely human. And I think a lot of it was designed on that last point in particular of like to give ourselves some grace when we're struggling with it. But knowing that and like keeping that in mind also, I think, helps give me grace to the other people, to people who just
Nice.
can't seem to cope with the change as well.
Nice.
And so I just found that helpful, and I thought about that with Dorothy's comment.
I so love that, because recognizing that no matter where we are, there are going to be people who are more into it than us, and there are going to be people that are going to be less into it than us. And wherever we are, the people that are more into it than us, the natural response can be like, can you just not? Like, it's not that exciting. Can you slow down? And then the reaction to the people who are not as into it as us can you just get with the program? Like, why are you dragging your feet? Like, this is where we come up with the idea of like change resistors, that like there's a bunch of people in the basement like cackling over how they're gonna like we're gonna ruin the change. They're just sad and scared, right? And so what I love about your comment, Megan, is having grace on both ends of the spectrum, recognizing that we are all showing up with different capacities and different strengths. And we can give ourselves grace, and we can also give grace to people that are struggling more than us, and to the folks that see the opportunity in this moment, even when we can't. Thank you for that reminder. So, talking practically now, for the most part, we can't eliminate the need for change. Also, if the change is happening to us, that's the whole point. We don't have control. But here's where we can do. Where we have control over change, can we slow down? Can we pause? I was just working with an organization this morning where we were talking about all these balls they have in the air, some of which they don't have control over, but like there's a couple of them they do. Maybe we pause those things. We're not thrilled about it, but it's better than everything blowing up because we're trying to do too much and pushing people beyond their capacity. So slow down, give ourselves space, reduce unnecessary cognitive load. So reducing the amount of internal work that people are having to do to make sense of what's happening. Create stability where possible. So anywhere where we can invent stability gives us more resilience to handle the places that are not stable. And also giving people flexibility where we can so that they can create stability for themselves. And so I'm going to talk tactically about what these things look like, but these are kind of my three main principles. Slow things down where we can, reduce cognitive load where we can, give stability and flexibility so that we have the resilience for places where things feel out of control. And so I'm going to talk about what it looks like to operationalize these things at the organizational level, at the team level, and at the individual level, thinking about, did I do this with time horizons? I think I did. Thinking about time horizons. So like quick wins, medium-term things, longer-term culture change strategies. So at the organizational level, my thinking is that the goal is to create clarity and stability where you can, name uncertainty where we can't. So that tension between saying, here's what we know, but acknowledging here are the things that we don't know so that no one's wondering. Reducing cognitive load so that people have the capacity to do their work well in the midst of all the stuff, right? So that is what we want to aim for at the organizational level. And so in terms of quicker, easier things that we can do to start to reach that goal, someone already talked about communication, having a clear, established, predictable communication cadence with aligned messaging. If I know that I'm getting an update from my CEO every Friday at 2:00 about what's happening in the world and what it means for us, I'm no longer thinking all week, what's happening? How is it affecting us? When am I going to find out? So all of that noise goes away. All that cognitive load goes away because I know I'm going to find out Friday at 2:00. And so consistent communication, even if it feels like over communication, is such a gift in terms of that cognitive overwhelm. Transparency about what we know and what we don't. We don't want people to guess. If we don't have information about something, if we as an information black hole, because our brains want to keep us safe, they project the worst possible scenario because our brains want to plan for the worst so that they can protect us, right? But what that means is that when we don't know what's happening, we assume the worst thing is happening, which feels terrible. So the more transparent we can be about here's what's happening, here's what we know, here's what all of us don't know, we're quieting that internal voice that wants to go to the worst possible scenario. Clarity around who is making what decisions and how. Again, reducing the cognitive load of like, if this happens, then what? Who's deciding on this? How do I give input into this decision? Make sure people are clear on that. And then as much as possible, and I know this is so much easier said than done in this moment, resisting where we can the instinct to escalate and be reactive. As much as possible, slowing down and thinking first. The more we're reactive, the more we're escalating, the more heightened all of this gets. So the more we can give ourselves space to slow down and think, we slow everything down, we can reduce that anxiety that happens. Again, I know, easier said than done. Midterm stuff. Stuff that takes a little bit longer, / maybe some money. People managers in organizations tend to be emotional buffers, right? They're absorbing a lot for their staff. They're getting stuff out of their way. They're listening to people. They're trying to attenuate messaging. They hold a lot. In moments of compounding change, that compounds for them too. So just making sure that your people managers are really well supported, that they have the information that they need, that there's space for them to get support either from an HR business manager, from their people manager. What kinds of mechanisms can you use to support people managers so that they can show up for their staff? Part of that is creating intentional spaces for people managers and leaders to process complexity, to name like what on earth is happening, to say those things out loud, and to sense make together. Here's how I see this. How do you see it? It is so important to have those spaces. If you don't have those spaces, what you'll find is that that work will show up in other meetings. And then those other meetings, suddenly you're not getting anything done, you're spiraling, you're not making decisions. It's because you need spaces to do this processing so that then you can look more sharply at the other work that you have to do. So creating spaces for that. And then medium term, where possible, where can you create policy level flexibility around people's time, autonomy, and work location so that people aren't having to ask, hey, supervisor, can I take 2 hours off to go to the doctor's? Hey, supervisor, I don't need to be on site tomorrow. Can I work from home? That relies too much on individual supervisors, which means individual experiences are going to be really inconsistent, and that can create inequity. And reduce cognitive load, build it into the policy so that you don't have to ask, so that there's no thinking involved. Give people that flexibility where you can and make it easy, make it automatic. That's something you can do in the midterm. Long term, and this is really about building an organizational culture that helps you be resilient in the face of all this change, is really about shared understanding of what is important to us and why. So a lot of what I talked about in the cognitive and emotional impact slide is how hard it is to figure out what you're supposed to do day to day when you're not clear on what's important. And so you're spending all that time churning. What do I focus on? What do I spend my time on? Who do I go to and why? So as much as possible, you want folks to have a consistent shared sense of this is what we do. This is why we do it. This is why it's important. These are the 3 core things that are most critical to us, so that as things pivot, they're pivoting up here, but everyone has this shared core that enables them to pivot more flexibly, that gives a smoother experience of those pivots. So that might be things like involving people across the organization in your strategic planning work, so people really have that visibility. Having regular strategy conversations. When you make big decisions about big changes, being really explicit about the why behind those decisions. So people are like, oh, that's what's important to us. That's why it's important to us. That's what helps you sustain that shared sense of what's important over time. So team, organizational level, these are some of the things that you can start to prioritize. Pausing for questions. How's this landing? Does this make enough sense? Am I being specific enough? Cool. Okay. Let's bump down a level. Teams. So I would say the goal at the team level is to create psychologically safe spaces where teams can process change together, build on that alignment around what matters, and to support each other in navigating shifts. So teams are often where you find the most social capital in organizations, the closest relationships, the most vibrant relationships. So how do you nurture that and grow that so that it is a source of resilience and strength for your organization? For me, that's what the team level work is all about. So short-term quick wins is make sure you're talking about this at team meetings. Build in space for processing and sense making. How are you folks doing? How are you handling things? How are you making sense of this, that, or the other thing? Make those conversations part of your work And as part of that, normalize asking for and offering to help with each other's workload. So we talked earlier about how in moments of change, some people are going to end up with less capacity for a whole host of reasons, and some people are going to have more. Be explicit about that. I had a team once where at the end of every meeting, we had people say, hey, I've got some extra time this week, or hey, I need help with something this week. Who can help me? Normalize that. So there's that culture of like, okay, if this is not a good, this is a low week for you, we can back you up. We can step in. You're safe with us. And again, just repeating the message of like being explicit about here are the things we know and here are the things we don't. Here's what's clear to us and what's not. So you're not wondering, does everybody else know this thing except me? No, none of us know it. Let's put it to the side for now and focus on what we do know. Midterm, so again, more time, maybe some investment needed here. Teams are an incredible mechanism for bi-directional communication. So making sure that what's happening at the leadership level is being well communicated all the way through the organization, and making sure that a team is a mechanism for folks who are doing the work to say, here's what I see. Here are ideas I have. Here's a challenge I'm seeing emerging. Here's an opportunity I see. The folks that are doing the work see those things in ways that leadership doesn't. And so how can we make sure that teams are spaces where we're harvesting those insights and sharing them, and also doing the same thing with what's happening. Here's what's happening at the leadership level. Here's this decision we made. Here's why we made it. So really leveraging those team moments to do that work. Making sure that as a team, you're clear on your priorities and your values. This is what we do. This is how it impacts our mission. This is why our work is important. These are the values that inform how we work. And then as a team, building on the quick wins, build consistent norms for how do you process stress as a group? What do you do in those moments? How do you handle conflict as a team in a way that builds versus degrades your relationships? How do you process uncertainty? What are the things that work for you as a group that help you get through tough moments? Planning for that so that you're not building those norms in the tough moments. You've already got something to lean on. You've got an established practice you can turn to. And then long-term, building on what I just said, developing shared habits around reflection, adaptation, and learning. How are you consistently checking in as a team and saying, what are we learning? How did that go? What do we want to do differently next time? We noticed last time this happened. How are we going to shift going forward? So having that be part of your team culture helps to build resilience. Investing in trust and psychological safety in the long term. And so making sure that teams at minimum are always a space where people can ask questions and hear honest answers, where it's okay to fail as long as you're learning from that failure. And then again, reinforcing the role of the team and the individuals on that team as a source of insights and solutions in moments where things are hard, because they're the ones out there doing the work. They know. So how do we formally make sure that we're asking those questions and getting that information? Okay, so far? I'm going to do one more slide and then I think we can have a bit of a chat. Individual level. The goal here for me is about supporting individuals to navigate that ongoing overlapping change in a real partnership. By that meaning recognizing the role that an organization can play in providing supports and expectations, but also recognizing that we're calling on individuals to have their own accountability in this, to be self-aware, to be mindful of the impact that you have on other people, recognizing that the way all of us show up impacts our team culture. And so really thinking about that as a partnership. What does each side bring to that conversation? So short term, naming and normalizing what we've been talking about, that people experience and carry change differently. That's fine. That's normal. That's to be expected. We are not all going to show up in the same way. And it might even be different change to change. Helping individuals and encouraging individuals to notice their own signs of overload and stress. So maybe building into one-on-one conversations with your supervisor, check-ins around how's your workload going? Are you feeling like it's manageable? I noticed that you were a little quiet in yesterday's meeting. Are you feeling like there's too much? So how do we build that in? And then being really explicit about boundaries and flexibility and support and making that explicit rather than assumed. So nobody's guessing what's expected of me. Nobody's guessing where can I ask for help. Lay all that out. Midterm strategies. This is where I think having really good benefits can be very helpful. So access to mental health supports, like through an EAP. I think somewhere in here, I also talk about like having good mental health care. So like making sure the insurance that you're providing staff includes coverage for mental wellness. Creating intentional opportunities for your team to connect and build relationships, both around the work, because the work is a source of shared value, but also just as human beings, making sure that there's time for you to spend together. That can be especially challenging in remote or hybrid environments, but there are ways to do it where you're really building those relationships. And then making sure individuals are really clear on their role and their work and its contribution to the mission. We're all in mission-driven work, mostly in part because we believe in the mission. So making sure that it's clear, we have a clear path between what we do and the impact we're trying to create in the world is really powerful. And then long-term, make sure we're normalizing using supports, asking for help, naming limits, setting boundaries, that it's safe to say, I'm tapped out this week, that it's safe to say, I really can't take calls after 5 o'clock, that all those things are normalized in your organization. Reinforcing names around expectations for self-awareness, responsibility, and care for collective impact. That if you're having a tough day, we're here to support you, and you can't take that tough day out on everybody around you. And so how do we find that balance? And then supporting individual learning around resilience and change. Is that training? Is that offsite work? Is that connecting people to other kinds of resources? But how are we making sure that people have the skills they need to do that self-management? The last thing I'll say, and then maybe we can do some chatting, is that for all the reasons we've talked about, my pleasure, Anne, glad to have you. For all the reasons we've talked about, there is no one size fits all. We all experience change differently. So if you're doing programming around change and resilience and not everybody's showing up, or only some people are showing up, or not everybody's participating, that makes sense. We all need different things. We all participate in different ways. The goal is to design for difference, to design with the assumption that different people need different things. And so rather than saying, this is our one way we're going to solve change pain in this organization, you're going to need to do a range of things so that you're meeting different sets of people's needs and the needs that are created by different kinds of change. That was a lot of talking from me. I hope that resonated. I want to pause and say, A, do folks have questions or reactions? And B, in the last few minutes we have, I am certain that some of you have done some of these things, and I would love to hear, what have you seen in practice? What have you seen work? What practices have you really struggled with that you kind of turned around? Are there ways that you've learned about doing this work that you're willing to share with the other fine folks on this call so that we can all do a better job? Or just if you have questions or reactions, that's cool too.
I guess I would say that one of your first slides was about the organizational level. And I think I've been through several different executive transitions in various capacities. And the times where there has been every Friday at 2 o'clock received an email that said, this is the update on, where we are in the search process or whatever it is, or where we are in whatever it is in terms of that process or how long it's going to take, and naming, the knowns and the unknowns. That has been incredibly helpful.
Mm,
really not stopped, but it gave people kind of a shared understanding, and I think really allowed people to feel like they weren't in the dark and they were also engaged in the process, even though they might not have been on like the hiring team or helping put
nice.
together the job description or something like that.
Nice. I love that. Thanks, Dorothy.
And I'll say that we're going through an executive director change, and I think what um, is nice is that the current executive director and our director of engagement and inclusion created these Friday office hours for people to stop
Mm,
in if they had questions, concerns, and I think it's great that they really created that space for people to really drop in, and just have a conversation
nice.
outside of a group.
I love that. And what I've seen sometimes when organizations do office hours like that is sometimes it's enough to just offer them. Sometimes people don't even go, but the knowledge that, like, I could go and I know that there's someone there that's going to answer my questions. For some people, that's enough. Just knowing that, like, I have that possibility, that there's transparency there. Oh, I'm glad to hear you've already got some of these things in place, Melanie. That's really good to hear. And hopefully, maybe there's some things here you can build on too. Any other experiences you've got in your own organizations of things that you've seen work well or where you've had trouble? Okay. So that's my story for today. It has been really nice getting to hang out with all of you. Um, in strange times, it's nice to find community and to talk about ways that we can all be making things a little bit easier for each other. And so I hope that there's something that we talked about here today that maybe makes things a little bit easier for you or your team or your organization. Um, I will circulate the slides from today as well as the recording so that if you want to go back to any of this, you are welcome to. Um, I'll also say two things. One is I really value feedback. Dorothy knows this because we work together. Like, I really value feedback. And so I'd love to hear it. If you found like this was helpful, if you found me to be incredibly annoying, if I went too fast, if the examples weren't good, like, I want to be helpful. So, like, I would really welcome that feedback. There's a QR code here. Um, I'll also drop a link in the chat. Um, and then the other thing I'm linking here is one of the things I started doing last year is what I am calling pro bono office hours, or essentially like if you just need like a brain that isn't yours for an hour to talk about something that's going on in your organization, I'm always happy to be that brain. I love the work that I get to do. I find it really fascinating and I like being helpful. And so if you're like, "Oh, I want to try implementing this thing we talked about in this class in this webinar," like feel free to like jump on my calendar and let's chat about it. And so there's a QR code here on the screen, and then I just dropped the link in the chat as well. So A, welcome your feedback always, and B, if you ever want to have a chat about things, now you know where to find me. And thanks for the positive feedback in the chat. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Julia. Bye.